Hello, this is the Adult Sunday School lesson for Sunday, September the 12th, 2021. Welcome back. Our lesson today is another from the book of Proverbs. It's entitled Knowledge, uh, and it comes from the Smith and Hellway's Connections Study Guide, which is a lectionary-based Bible study, and that's the basis for our discussion. The unit in the lesson is entitled Living Wisely. It contains four lessons that we will be looking at, or we have looked at in the month of September. Last week was fairness. Today is entitled Knowledge. Next week it will be character, and then the final lesson is entitled Courage. All these are ways for us to live faithfully as God's people in today's world. The fairness lesson concentrated on just treatment for others. The knowledge lesson really applies to all 4 weeks, but it introduces a personification of wisdom. In the English language, our nouns do not have gender. Some of our pronouns do, of course, but in other languages, such as the biblical languages, the nouns all have a gender, and the noun for wisdom in both the Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament is feminine in gender, and sometimes it's called Sophia for wisdom, and so that is the characterization of the lesson in the book of Proverbs for this week. And we're going to look at the ideal woman or wife next week, and we'll look at the book of Esther for an example of courage in living wisely. So just so that we're aware of this, wisdom can be many things. It's the ability to contemplate and act based upon knowledge, experience, understanding, common sense, and insight. Wisdom is associated with such attributes as unbiased judgment. In other words, to be wise is not to discriminate. We need to show compassion in what we do. It's based on experience in the world, and there's no greater teacher of wisdom than our own self-knowledge. And we have to get beyond ourselves. We all have a vested interest in reality and what we think we need to get from the world, but wisdom in the world and fairness in the world extends beyond our limited individual subjective insight. So it's not just what I want, what I think is wise, but it's what works in the world. Wisdom also includes such virtues as ethics and benevolence. In other words, we have to behave properly and show goodwill, be generous to those around us. It's wise to do so because it helps not only ourselves prosper, but helps others in the world prosper. In the Bible sense, we tend to think the Old Testament wisdom literature is written by men for men, but females play a big part in demonstrating divine wisdom. In fact, one of David's wives, Abigail, is mentioned as a person that provided good, wise counsel to him. And King Solomon, for whom many of the Proverbs were named or were written, is seen here in this woodcut to be consorting with Dame Wisdom, one of the primary architects of his wisdom. So it's not just a male attribute. We're short-sighted if we see it as that, but wisdom extends to wise counsel we receive from both men and women. In today's lesson, wisdom is personified in terms of a lady wisdom and also a lady that leads us into folly. I like this picture that shows, on the one hand, a wise, generous, fine demonstration of the personification of wisdom, but there's also a dark nature to it that if we follow will lead us into the path of destruction, exemplified by the dark character there. So these are the 2 women of Proverbs. I can't emphasize enough what a good idea it would be to look up this BibleProject.com. In addition to these one-page summaries of the whole book for each book of the Bible, there are also videos that walk through the derivation of this and other videos in this series that describe. And in the book of Proverbs, for example, the introductory chapters are chapters 1 through 9. Then in chapters 11 through 29, there are many proverbs that are listed for our edification and well-being. And then chapters 30 and 31 are summaries, have a different context for these wise sayings. So that's the overall picture of the book of Proverbs. Today we are looking from the very first chapter, which would be an introduction to Proverbs. By way of background, wisdom literature in the Bible, which includes the book of Proverbs, you'll find there's no plot, no stories, no characters, and I indicate even no theology. There is an underlying assumption that if you follow the ways of Yahweh, you're going to prosper in the world, but that's it. There's no call to observe the Mosaic Code. There's no call to prayer or to demonstrate in any sacrificial way, to worship in any sacrificial way. So the book of Proverbs is really a good study in the workplace. When I was working at Lexmark, a group of us would get together before the start of the business each day, and every day we would read one of the Proverbs. And the book of Proverbs is really a good one to start with because there are 31 of them. And so on the first of the month, you start with Proverbs 1. Then the next day you go to Proverbs 2. And so whatever day of the month it is, you can read that proverb. And it's really a good way to start your day. It's a good way to start reading the Bible if you want to systematically read the Bible and haven't delved into it to a great extent. One of the easy ways is to start with the book of Proverbs and just read the proverb that's numbered for the day of the month you're in. I did this for a year. I would also, in addition to reading the proverb for the day, it just so happens that Beethoven wrote 32 piano sonatas, and so I would also listen to the Beethoven piano sonata numbered for the day of the month. It was really an uplifting thing. I highly recommend it. Many of the proverbs deal with sexual content, and they're therefore too racy to be read in public worship. I can't imagine pastor actually reading some of them, but they're also written in a special form. The poetic books of the Bible, which include Job, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Song of Psalms, and Lamentations, have a poetic form as well as a special content. The content of Proverbs is wisdom, how to be wise, but it's not declarative prose that we'd find in a textbook, but rather it's written in a poetic style. And that lends to some of the beauty of Proverbs. So these Israelite wise men were a particular group, kind of like the prophets and the priests, who provided counsel to the young people as they were growing up and ready to assume responsibilities outside the family situation. These wise men of Israel would be analogous to modern day CPAs, attorneys, accountants, organizational consultants, people you would read for self-help or go to for individual counseling. So they had a definite role and function. Here's one of the examples of the advice they give, which it says it's better to stay outside on the roof of your house than to live inside with a nagging wife. So you can see it's got kind of a realistic or humorous edge to it as well. The wisdom books, there are 3 wisdom books in the Old Testament, which include Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. Biblical poetry, the poetic books of the Bible, have 2 features. One is accent, and that means the words are to be pronounced in a particular meter. Now, these accents do not carry over into English because when you translate a word from one language into another language, it's not going to sound the same. For example, the French word for library is bibliothèque. Even has more syllables than the English word. So if you try to rhyme library, bibliothèque doesn't rhyme. The German word for castle is Schluss. So Schluss and castle do not rhyme. So you can't rely on the words sounding the same to get the poetic meaning. However, there is parallelism, which is the rhyming of meaning. The meanings do carry over into the other language. And I have 3 symbols here. The equal sign, that represents a synonymous parallelism. So a statement or a line will be presented, then the next line will be basically saying the same thing but in slightly different words. That's one way they're parallel. The X sign is an indication of antithetical or opposite parallelism. The first line will say something and then it'll be repeated a second way, but the opposite sense will be indicated. Then by this increasing sign or crescendo bar, sometimes the parallelism doesn't merely stay static, but it carries the meaning to a new and higher level. So these are the keys to look for in biblical poetry. Is it saying the same thing for emphasis? Is it contrasting it by showing the opposite? Or is it presenting new truth, which is a crescendo statement of the first statement? So there are 3 sources of Old Testament text. The book of Proverbs you will find in its Hebrew translation, which is the oldest, most sacred to the Israelites. It's found in the sacred Hebrew scriptures. There is a later Greek translation of these Hebrew texts, which were favored at a point in history when the Hebrew language was dying out and the Greek language was in its ascendancy. They're slightly different. The real hardline conservative children of Israel, they favor the Hebrew text. The more liberal modern outlook would look to the Greek translation called the Septuagint. But there's a third version of the Hebrew scriptures, which was not discovered in the 20th century, that is exemplified in this Dead Sea Scrolls. And I mention that today because our text from chapter 1 also appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'll be reading that textual version, which is slightly different than we'll find in our quarterly. Basically it's the same, but it is slightly different. So wisdom is tied to justice and fairness. You're not wise in the world if you're making fun of others or putting others to the disadvantage. As Christians, we have a lens. We look at these wisdom sayings in terms of a Christian lens. We believe Jesus' words and deeds are the truer reflection of God's greatest wisdom, but that's not to negate the power that you find in the Hebrew scriptures. So here in our chapter today, in our text today, we'll find 2 voices that are calling us to be wise. One is the lady of wisdom, which says, do these things and you'll prosper. And the other is the lady of folly, which sometimes we follow to our detriment. But wisdom is available, but we're not always the wisest, and sometimes we choose the path of folly. Wisdom versus folly. Sometimes some of the same behaviors can result in both wisdom and folly. If we do too much of it or to do one behavior to the exclusion of others, sometimes we end up in a place of folly, which we did not intend to be in. So the wisdom literature reflects right relationships with God and community. These 2 voices exert influence. Sometimes wisdom and folly are personified, as we find here. But it's important to remember that Proverbs assumes that wise living results in rewards. Foolishness leads to punishments. That's a general rule. And while it's true, as a general rule, there are exceptions. We read the book of Job, and the book of Job challenges this theology. It's an exception to the general rule that following God, following the wise path, doing the right thing leads to prosperity and wisdom. Because Job tells us, or he assumes that he has done these things, but he is suffering immensely. So the wisdom in the book of Proverbs does not come at an impersonal it, as a teaching commandment or ritual or worship practice, but as a personal I. It's an indication of instruction, personal instruction to us from God. Wisdom is a personal presence of Yahweh in the world, calling for right living. It's not a separate deity unto itself, but it is a vehicle by which we understand and follow God in a deep way. So it's not book learning, but it's practical advice to achieve an aim. Sometimes you could even call it craftiness. For example, when David is counseling Solomon, his son, in order to do away with Joab, the word there for David is he's presenting wisdom to Solomon. It may not be ethically pure and everything, but it does achieve a purpose of getting Joab out of the picture, which was what Solomon wanted all along. So wisdom can be useful. If it's self-serving, it's not true godly wisdom in the long term. Job is a righteous man that suffers. Proverbs presents foundational information as universal truths, but there are always exceptions. Like in English, we have this rule for spelling: use I before E, except after C, or when sounded as A, as in neighbor and way. So there are general rules, but there are also exceptions. So the wise person is aware of the general rule, but also aware that there are exceptions. One of the ways to look at it, as our lesson writer wrote this week, if Proverbs is a high school text, then Job is a graduate seminar. So Job is not for rudimentary education, but it's for further discussion of a general rule. Basic rules matter, but so do the exceptions. So let's get into our text for today. The first section is wisdom in the street. I'm going to read this from our lesson guide. Wisdom cries out in the street. In the squares, she raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge? Give heed to my reproof. I will pour out my thoughts to you. I will make my words known to you. So in verse 20, wisdom cries out in the streets, and in the squares she raises her voice. This is almost perfect example of synonymous parallelism, saying about the same thing. Verse 21 likewise says, at the busiest corner she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates she speaks. Again, the same thing. These are parallel statements, but they indicate that wisdom is not a private thing. It's not found only in your own heart or in your own head or available to us individually. It's like there are open paths that lead to, one way leads to wise wisdom, prosperity, and one way, if we follow exclusively, will lead to folly and downturn. Continuing in verse 22 emphasizes, how long, O simple ones, will I endure you? How long will the scoffers enjoy their position? They're going to result in hate. These people who hate knowledge. Now, I believe there's a crescendo going on in verse 22. How long, O simple ones, will I love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and hate knowledge? So there's a command here. Give heed to my reproof. Pour out my thoughts. Make my words known to you. So this goes beyond a simple declaration of the need to embrace more of a concerted wisdom. And then there's a command that if you do not do so, then I will reprove you, or I will bring judgment to you. That goes beyond just a mere statement of the first clauses in verse 22. We move on to calamity and panic in verses 24 to 31. Again, I'm going to read this in the from the quarterly. It's more of an extended passage, I should say. But this is the portion that also appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, and so I'll indicate there are 5 or 6 changes in wording, not drastic changes, but it's not identical reading. Verse 24 says, "Because I have called and you refused, have stretched out my hand and no one heeded, and because you have ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when panic strikes you. When panic strikes you, you like a storm, and your calamity comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel, and despised all my reproof. Therefore, they shall eat the fruit of their way and be sated with their own devices." So this adds information to the calculation here. They hated knowledge. They did not choose the fear of Yahweh. You know, one of the adages or proverbs of the Bible, fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. There's wisdom in that. But people who don't take that path, they may learn to regret it. They will have none of my counsel. I try to provide counsel and guidance and reproof or corrective action, but they despise these things and will not hear of it. Therefore, they shall eat the fruit of their way, like Adam and Eve. The image recalls Adam and Eve. They wanted an independent path. They went against God's teaching. They ate from the forbidden fruit, and their appetite was sated or bloated. They were bloated on what they received. Their own desires led to their downfall, which is a picturesque way of saying sometimes when we follow our own desires and our own information without seeking God's input or out factoring in God's wisdom, we sometimes get what we want in the short term, and it turns out we don't like it. It makes us sick. We eat too much, we get fat. We drink too much, we get drunk. We spend all of our money on frivolous things, and then we have no nest egg when times get rough. So we've pursued what we wanted, and we're receiving the benefit of what we thought was what we wanted, but it turned out not to be so wise after all. Oh, these are heartfelt, hard-learned lessons of life that we would do wise to factor into our daily life. There's no need to go into point by point the different wording. It's slightly different words in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's not additional new thoughts, but they're paraphrased in a slightly different way. But the image is, I called, but you refused. I stretched out my hand, but you didn't heed. I spoke, but you did not listen. You did not hear my reproof. You know, that's a human nature when we are trying to respond in kindness to someone or to trying to help someone, but we're ignored or made fun of or ridiculed. That hurts us at a deep level, and we don't want to be helpful. And so I hear some of this in the words of these wise men that says even God is that way. When God tries to help, but we refuse that counsel, then God is ready to laugh at us. Not laughing at us, but laughing at the calamity we're in. And really, when panic strikes us, we're a pathetic sight to God. And I'm sure it grieves his heart, but what more could he do? When we panic, it's like we're in a whirlwind. We're flitting here and there. We don't have our feet firmly grounded. And so distress follows us. When they call on me, but I will not answer. It's only after we get into these dire situations that really cannot be salvaged in a helpful way. Then we call on God, but it's too late. We can't really connect in a useful way. Here's an example I found of a picture of sowing the wind and reaping the whirlwind. I believe those are words in the prophet Hosea, but it's applicable here in Proverbs, that the way of folly sometimes leads us in a way that produces a whirlwind of panic and anxiety and problems. So, though wisdom comes from God, wisdom starts out first by knowing ourselves. What are our tendencies? What are our preferences? Instead of doing what's right, sometimes we go the wrong way. And it's not merely the injection of a fact that makes us wise, but rather it's understanding how these facts work together. This is what Albert Einstein was famous for. He said if you couldn't explain a fact in a simple way that anyone can understand, then you don't really understand the fact yourself. So these are not hard teachings in Proverbs. They're saying, seek Yahweh, follow wise counsel. Don't follow ways that lead to foolish destruction. Which leads us to our third passage from this text, which I will read. It's only a couple of verses. And this is kind of the summary of the lesson. Waywardness kills the simple, and the complacency of fools destroys them. So waywardness and complacency are our enemy. But those who listen to me will be secure and will live at ease without dread of disaster. So waywardness kills the simple, complacency of fools destroys them. But those who listen to me will be secure, live at ease without dread of disaster. Does that mean bad things never happen? No, of course not. But we are secure in that when we anchor our knowledge, anchor our beliefs and security in the Almighty, and are willing to listen to guidance that helps us out of bad situations, at least we can be confident and secure and not always fearful. Listening, then, is our bridge to knowledge and wisdom. I think it's wise. We've got 2 ears, 1 mouth. We need to double the amount of listening to our talking. This is a lesson I learned, I keep learning week after week. When I get into disagreements with people, frequently I have discovered it's because I'm not listening. I'm spending too much of my time talking or recounting or trying to combat what I'm hearing rather than listening and fully hearing what the other person is saying. I've made a vow to Gail that I'm going to do more listening than talking in the future, and I hope that I am benefiting from these lessons as well. You know, I've been foolish so many times in my life. I've been oblivious to my best interests. And it's a shame because God does not want us to be oblivious to prosperity and oblivious to wisdom and the good life. And He's providing ways for us to attain it. So I pray that I will not be as foolish in the future as I have been in the past. Where did this come from? I tried to get on the internet an image of Dame Wisdom, of Sophia, and I get Sophia Loren. Nice to look at, but not exactly personification of wisdom. Here is what I meant to get is this is the personification of wisdom that you'll find up at the University of Notre Dame. You know, it's good to seek God in terms of His wisdom or guidance away from the paths of folly. So it's helpful for me to remember that our life is a quest to follow the wise way. Here are some questions that might be of benefit to you in your class. which I intend to use in my class. Why would someone choose being foolish rather than being wise? You know, if you say it like that, you say, well, I don't choose foolishness because on the surface it seems the wise thing to do. But many times I've fallen victim to what I wanted to eat, what I wanted to experience, and found out that it really wasn't the best thing for me. I could have been wiser in my selection. So I hope that in the future I will choose more wisely. And what are some of the prices we pay for being foolish? Sometimes they are minor inconvenience, but sometimes if we're foolish in the long run, we can lose health, lose job, lose spouse, lose our lives by foolishness. So there's always a big price to be paid for being foolish. Hopefully we'll get some good discussion in our classes about that. And then what are some of the steps we can take to keep on hearing God's wisdom throughout our whole lifetime? I think it's foolish to shut off our minds to new learning. It's foolish to say, well, I don't need to hear this. I don't need to hear the pastor preach. I can just turn away, kind of turn off my religious sensibilities for a while. If we do that, I think we're inviting calamity and foolishness in our way. You could probably think of some better questions, but I hope that you will pursue it with your classes and use this as a fruitful conversation about how God wants good for us and how we can thwart those intentions to the extent we're not open to God's wisdom. Well, thank you for joining me today. Remember, don't take me too seriously. I'm giving, it's a reasonable interpretation, but certainly not the only interpretation. I like this disclaimer. I'm an amateur only. I don't mean to discount that, but I'm not a professional, not seminary trained. You need to check the sources, read the Bible, go to BibleProject.com, ask other people, talk to people that you have a high opinion of, ask the pastor, ask your Sunday school teacher things. Remember our prayer concerns. One of the greatest values of our Sunday school class is we always talk about and lift up in prayer those that we know of who are in need of concern, and hopefully this empowers us to say or do a helpful thing in those prayer concerns. And we'll see you next week. We have another lesson from the book of Proverbs. Again, I want to thank Daryl Elster for reconfiguring the studio, for all of his good work and making this presentation, I think, much clearer than it was last week. And so thank you, Daryl. So again, I invite you to examine these wonderful sources, including the Scripture, and we'll see you next week.